we've been speaking about for a while, and now it's obviously in its ninth year. It's a good opportunity to kind of look ahead towards next year, but say, well, this is how far we have come in that over that period of time. But as we all know, fraud in general, but especially charity fraud, is international. So if we can sit here today with an expert like yourself, Ian from Australia, an expert like Dave and Hope as well from the UK, I think it really shows what we can do internationally, those lessons that are going on in Australia, the UK. Really just have that conversation that we can host on the website so charities and all of our contacts can drop in and see that there are different approaches, but what are the commonalities as well between us. So I'll just start really by, as I say, it's going onto the website. So if I could just ask yourself, Ian, just a brief introduction of your background, your role and the ACNC, please.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Really pleased to be part of the webinar and support the International Charity Fraud Awareness Week. As you mentioned, my name's Ian Parry. I'm a Senior Compliance Manager in the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. We regulate the registered charities in Australia, of which there's about 63,000 odd. So really interested in sharing the experience of Australia, and I think it does have a lot of commonality with charities that operate in different jurisdictions and their experience, making sure they have strong regulation, to deal with charities. I think there's a really good message there as well for the charities that are operating to understand how they can have good governance to support their activities.
Thank you. Dave?
Yeah, hi. So my name is Dave Carter and I'm the head of fraud for the British Council. So my sort of background was in law enforcement, and then I got into the sort of international charity fraud awareness, working at a different charity before landing at the British Council. So the British Council is an arm's length body of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Foreign and Common and Development Office of the UK government, and we're also the UK's international organisation for cultural relations and educational opportunities. But most people know us overseas for our English language teaching and examination overseas.
Thanks, Dave. Hope?
Yeah, so I'm Hope Sapie. I'm a Senior Executive of Fraud Advisory Panel. Work with all things charities and bringing people into the counter-fraud space. And my background is in not fraud until about 4 years ago, and then it was in fraud. So that's how I got into it, how I fell straight into counter fraud. Fraud Advisory Panel has run Charity Fraud Awareness Week for the last 9 years, and worked in the charity space for a really long time. And it really aims to bring everyone together to collaborate and bring the public, private, and third sector together to kind of show best practice in a way that everyone can understand.
Thanks, Hope. So, yeah, those sort of backgrounds and experiences of why we've all got together. I think there's so much that we can all bring to this conversation, all with the idea of helping charities, essentially. I think, Ian, the best place to start, really, so you and I have spoken a while, the conduct standards that you have in Australia is something that really interests me, and I think it's a really great model to kind of showcase, really. If you could just tell us about that, and then if we just open up the conversation, really.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So yeah, really pleased to be able to discuss my experience and the experience in the ACNC. We have the external conduct standards, which apply to charities that operate overseas. So they are parallel with what we refer to as the governance standards, which applies to all charities operating inside Australia. But for those charities that also operate internationally abroad, they're the applicable external conduct standards. And the principle is around good governance. It's ensuring that charities, when they do operate overseas, they do so in a way that furthers their charitable purpose and does so in a way that ensures that their charitable funds are used to further the charitable purpose and are not misused. A really important point, I think, is that external conduct standards apply when charities are working with partner organisations. So, a common example might be We've got an Australian-based charity, and it just sends funds overseas to an organisation that's running a project. The external conduct standards apply to the Australian charity, and they need to be accountable for how those funds are applied to support a charitable purpose by that third party, whatever it might be. There's a range of things that, of course, can operate overseas to support a charitable purpose. You think of overseas aid to support the alleviation of hunger and those kind of things, building infrastructure, those type of projects. The idea of supporting charities is really strong for the ACNC. We really have, the idea of promoting and investing in governance, and it can be a real challenge for charities, I think, because they need to use their resources strategically. It's a big challenge to alleviate things like poverty and use your funds wisely. But we really do support charities to invest in governance and bring on board those skills and resources to actually be able to make their decisions better, which in the long run will ensure that charities deliver a charitable purpose more effectively. And that's what the external conduct standards do. I might just quickly run through what the external conduct standards are. There's 4 of them, and I think 3 of them are applicable to preventing fraud. The first one is the activity and control of resources. So this places an obligation on charities when they are using their resources, sending funds overseas, or it might be other assets. Food hampers might be an example. They need to ensure that that is done with a not-for-profit nature and furthers their charitable purpose. If you look at it from the flip side, ensuring that funds aren't misused for a personal benefit that's non-charitable. So that's external conduct standard 1. Going on to external conduct standard 2, this is more about reporting and record keeping, and it's ensuring that charities conduct an annual review of their overseas activities and record keeping. External conduct standard 3, which is the directly relevant one when we're talking about fraud awareness, is anti-fraud and anti-corruption. Charities need to have in place risk management to ensure that they have anti-fraud and anti-corruption, and I'll go on to talk about that a little bit further. External conduct standard 4 is a little bit different, but very important from our perspective, and it's the protection of vulnerable individuals, making sure that the beneficiaries of charities, including staff and volunteers as well, aren't exploited or subject to abuse and those kind of things. Just talking a little bit about the ACNC's regulatory approach. So we really do have a structure where first we look to provide education and guidance to charities to either keep them on track or get them back on track to support them to do their best work to deliver their charitable purpose. Of course, there are some charities who are either unwilling or not capable to get back on track, and that's where we have a suite of stronger powers that we will use to ensure that charitable funds are not misused, and it really supports one of our objects, which is maintaining public trust and confidence in the charity sector. So just revisiting those specific external conduct standards, I mentioned that ECS 1 and ECS 2 around the control of the charity's assets and resources and the annual review of the record keeping. They're applicable to preventing fraud, but I'll focus on ECS 3, which is the anti-fraud and anti-corruption. So ECS 3 requires charities to take reasonable steps to manage risks of corruption, fraud, bribery, or other financial impropriety from its directors, employees, volunteers, and third parties outside of Australia. And it also requires charities to identify and document any perceived or actual conflicts of interests. Yeah, conflicts of interest is a very strong principle that we kind of ensure that charities have good governance around. We see that charities can really lose their way and have poor financial management, and at the worst end of it, that can lead to fraud, where charities don't have good controls around conflict of interest, and ensuring that their decision making is very transparent and in the best interest of the charity. So the purpose of External Conduct Standard 3 is to give the public confidence that a registered charity that operates outside of Australia is managed in a way that ensures that the risks to its assets are minimised and the charity and its resources are furthering its purposes. It's intended to ensure a charity takes steps to minimise the risk of resources being stolen or misused for illegal or illicit purposes. I'll just run through a few definitions. Very hopeful and confident that the audience is aware of what these definitions mean. But if you'll allow me, I'll just read out what our definitions are in Australia around these concepts in the ACNC. So fraud occurs when someone acts in a dishonest or deceptive way to gain a benefit, also that someone else experiences a loss. Corruption, we define, corruption refers to dishonest or illegal behaviour for private gain, especially by people with power or influence. Some charities operate in countries or regions with a high degree of corruption. And for the external conduct standards, bribery occurs when someone offers money or something of value to a public official to persuade them to do something in their official duties that they would not otherwise do, and it's for an advantage. So this can occur across a range of different types of organisations, but yeah, it's good to be mindful that charities can be particularly susceptible to this due to their operations overseas. So having suitable policies and procedures to combat these threats is really important. And just again, that idea of having good governance, investing in good governance reaps rewards for charities and allows them to better deliver their charitable purpose by having effective decision making. It reduces the chance of charities losing money through fraud or other financial misconduct. It reduces the chance of charities contributing payments or other gifts knowingly or unknowingly to corrupt people or organisations. Reduces the risk of charities damaging its reputation and losing funding, and also, reduces the risk of the regulators coming knocking on their door as well. So there's a number of things charities can do to manage these risks of fraud, corruption, and bribery. A couple of them I'll mention: having clear policies and adequate controls to ensure that there's effective decision making. I think I've mentioned it a few times already, investing in good governance, but, it's really important to get that message across that, those charities that are taking steps to use charitable funds, having that governance as the safety net to ensure that the decision-making is really effective is important. The financial management and financial controls, we really encourage good governance around that. Recruitment processes can be really important as well. Just having transparent and accountable recruitment processes to making sure that the staff who are making decisions on behalf of the charity have those skills and integrity to mitigate the risk, and charities can operate with confidence in that respect. It's important to keep really strong records of your decision making that aids transparency and accountability. Conflict of interest policy, I'll mention again. There's often risks related to what we refer to as related party transactions. That's where charities might enter into a transaction with a person where they have a relationship. It might be a partner who owns a company, and the company's going to provide services on behalf of the charity. Those kind of conflicts of interest can often lead charities to not act in the best interest of the charity. So it's important that the decision making is clear and transparent there. When you're working with third parties, it's really important to check the third party's reputation and experience so that you can have confidence that when you're providing those funds to a third party, they're going to be used in a way that furthers the purpose of the charity, and that those funds are used in a not-for-profit nature. So yeah, I might end there, Matt, if that's okay. Happy to further the discussion around the external conduct standards, but I will end by just reiterating the importance of good governance and investing in good governance to support charities to make effective decisions and act in their best interests.
Thanks, Ian. I think it's perfect sort of way to end that. Absolutely, that's what we, as the Fraud Advisory Panel, and all of us as a group, focus on: prevention, good governance. Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Sorry, I didn't wish to cut you off there, but I was just very interested in what you're talking about then, Ian. And it does mirror an awful lot of what we call the global counter fraud standards, which we've introduced within our own organisation. I suppose two sort of big questions, which you may not have enough time to answer. One is, I'd be really interested to know a little bit more information about what caused you to create these standards, and sort of how did you go about it, trying to balance you can make them very complicated, therefore very helpful, but therefore difficult to embed, or very simple, less effective, but easier to embed. So I'm kind of interested in how these kind of developed. And the second question, if I may, is basically about, you touched upon this, but how are they enforced? You know, light touch, regulatory powers, because obviously we find that having a set of standards is great, but they're next to useless unless they're actually enforced. So those are the sort of couple of things I was interested in. You're on mute.
I think I went on mute there. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, happy to answer those questions. No problem at all. Just addressing that first question about how the external conduct standards came about and how we actually define them. A little bit of engagement with another not-for-profit entity was a starting point for us. We refer to it as ACFID. It's the Australian Council for International Development. And that's a group of registered charities that actually have substantial operations overseas. I won't name names, but some of the big ones that I think would operate internationally, and all the countries around the world would be familiar with these names. So they actually had self-regulation in place as a starting point. They said for us to operate effectively in the international space and mitigate risks of things like misuse of our funds, and risks of fraud and corruption, we're going to put in place some standards. So what we did is we used that as a starting point to have the conversation about, well, it's not only these select member organisations that can benefit from this, it's the broader group of registered charities that operate overseas. And often what we find is it's the charities that are new to the game that are often most at risk, that they might not have that experience and skills of people who have had vast experience running not-for-profits. It's charities that have this really good initiative that they want to do good work overseas, but they don't have that experience behind them. So what the external conduct standards did is that it actually applied obligations to all charities that are registered in Australia and operate overseas. And it provides the guardrails for them about how they should do their work in a way that best serves their interest. So in terms of the second question, the importance of us as a regulator following through to ensure that we effectively regulate charities to make sure that the charitable funds are used effectively. I think I mentioned that charities have limited resources. It's no different for regulators, is my experience. In regulators, we really need to be strategic with how we use our resources to regulate the 63,000 charities that are registered with the ACNC. Now, not all of them operate overseas. So with the external conduct standards, it's only a minor proportion. And when I say a minor proportion, even if it's, say, 30% that operate overseas, we're still talking about large numbers in 20,000 odd that might operate overseas in different degrees. So yeah, what we try to do is we try to have an approach that is firstly education and guidance. We've done a lot of work through things such as this, webinars, and providing self-evaluation checklists to charities to make them aware of their obligations and self-serve, so to speak, so that they can actually take steps themselves to improve their governance. When we become aware of information that charities are doing the wrong thing, we do work with other government agencies that shares information lawfully with the ACNC. We'll take steps to work out what is the best compliance response to deal with that non-compliance. One of the higher risks that we mentioned, it's not something that I mentioned yet because we've been talking about fraud, corruption and bribery, is the risks of terrorism financing, something that's very high on the radar of Australia and Australian government, and I'm sure it is around the world as well. Just ensuring that charities have strong financial controls to ensure that their charitable funds are not at the risk of misuse of terrorism financing. So when we're getting into that space of serious and significant non-compliance, that's where we'll kind of look to use our enforcement powers a little bit more proactively. I hope that answers the question, Dave. Thank you for the questions.
No, absolutely. Very interesting.
You bring up a really interesting point when it came to why this came about, because we see it similarly in the week, in Charity Fraud Awareness Week, and our work across the board here, because for a lot of it, we rely heavily on larger charities or charities with the know-how, the expertise and the resource to write the material, to be the voice for charities that are new to the game, who are probably just a bit too small or just don't have the resource. So it's interesting to see that parallel across the pond.
It's a really good message. The resources are out there. For a lot of charities, I think they may think, oh, this is too hard. How do I actually take that first step? But one message I would share with charities who have that experience is there's a lot of resources out there to help them take that first step. So yeah, I really support that point. Hope you don't have to start from scratch there, and it is a very collaborative kind of network of charities. I find they're often willing to share their resources. So yeah, that's a really important message that if a charities are feeling overwhelmed by the responsibilities to have good governance, often the first step can be the easiest because there will be tools and resources available to support them.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've found quite a lot is that charities have an over-reliance on their defence of, well, we're a charity, so who would commit fraud against us? Whereas the reality is that to people who are likely to commit fraud, they are more likely to commit fraud against a charity because they don't care about the charitable objectives. They just see a weak organisation that has an over-reliance on trust and doesn't have enough sort of controls in place. So in the sort of 10 years I've been in this sector, I've seen this kind of journey where people have just, why do we need a counter fraud team? Why do we even need a fraud policy? We're good people doing good stuff around the world, so we don't even need this, because the vast majority of people that work for charities, the concept of committing or having a fraud is just so abhorrent to them that they just assume that everybody else would be the same. As we all know, then that's just the environment where fraud is more likely. So it's very much, it's when, not if. And the message we try to land with everybody is that if you're running a charity, assuming that a fraud is going to happen to you one day, what do you wish you knew or had in place the day before that happened, so that when that lands on your desk, and often fraud committed against charities has an internal element. It's often done by people in a higher trust or more senior position. So when that lands on your desk, what do you wish you had in place? So just to have a few simple guidelines, a policy, so you can turn around and say that this is unacceptable behavior, a response plan, so you know what to do, so you're not trying to make it up as you go along. I mean, that in itself is probably the single biggest sort of tip that we can provide, because it will happen. But when it happens, just be prepared for it.
Yeah, one of the things that will really drive that home this week, at least. So obviously, this going out, we're on a Wednesday, but we've had the results of the survey, or at least the key points. And one of the things that came out again, straight to your point, Dave, is that 50% of the reported frauds committed against charities were by insiders.
Yeah,
it's the same as last year. It's the same thing. But the thing that went up, which is interesting, and kind of it shows there's a changing environment, but that people do see charities as a target, is that 29% were committed by people that the charity didn't know about. So that is higher than previous years. So it is an interesting change. But we also saw again that charities, 42% of the charities who took the survey experienced a fraud, which is almost the same as an individual. We're seeing the same kind of levels of fraud across every part of society. It's not just frauds committed against charities, it's individuals. And it's just, you're right, you need to expect it's going to happen and just be ready, however that looks for you, for when it does.
Yeah, I mean, one of the guiding principles of fraud management is that it is ever changing.
Yeah.
And generally, certainly organised criminals who do target charities, of that there is no doubt. They evolve very swiftly, and obviously we've got 29 minutes into this webinar without mentioning AI yet, and AI is going to fling the door wide open. When you've got, we've already had a case where somebody has created an AI video of one of our most senior colleagues, asking them to do send them some cash, oh, I'm at an airport, someone stole my wallet, I need some of that sort of classic CEO fraud. But when there's one thing when someone's sending you a text message out of the blue, but when somebody is, you know, there face to face, so to speak, with an AI doppelganger, it does change the landscape somewhat.
Yeah, you can't even trust what you're seeing or you're hearing.
Yeah, and only yesterday we had a sort of situation where one of our suppliers sent out a some questionnaire survey with a link in it, and we had a flurry of emails from people saying, "Oh, this vendor sent us this email, and they want to, and we're worried about clicking on this link." And how fantastic is that? Because they're so people are so sort of ingrained to challenge these things now. It turned out to be totally legitimate, but checking first was totally the right thing to do. So we went back to this organization and said, "You've sent these emails out. What's this all about? You caused a bit of a flurry of concern because it came out of the blue. That was what was the problem." But I think that the message is getting out. But as I say, fraud will always change. There's various truisms with fraud. There will always be fraud. Of that that is true, and also fraud will always change. So you need to keep evolving with it. You'll have never nailed it.
On that point, Dave, you mentioned the global counter fraud standards that you've got.
Yeah.
See, I know a bit about those. I'm speaking to you and working with you. Could you give us a bit of an overview of what they are? Because obviously mindful that there'll be different countries and different people looking at this. Just a real rough overview, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I bet you, without really seeing Ian's standards, and only really hearing about them for the first time today, I bet you if we put the two lists together, they wouldn't be that far apart. Because they're both, which is why I was interested in how they were developed, because they're both developed from circumstances dictating what you see. You mentioned conflict of interests, Ian. You mentioned recruitment. These are all things that feature in our standards. You mentioned the importance of record keeping. Again, that appears in our standards. We've tried to keep them very simple because we know full well that if we make things complicated, that will turn people against them. So they're quite straightforward. They could be a lot more effective if we made them more complicated, but we think the net loss of that is not worth it. So we've kept them sort of kind of straightforward. But how they came about was really a drive for prevention, because as I mentioned in my introduction, my background is in law enforcement, and so my sort of adult life has been, searching and investigating the bad guys and trying to bring them to some form of sanction or justice. And the same is true regardless of what hat you're wearing. So my sort of happy space, if you like, is something has happened and we go off and investigate it, and then we bring it to a conclusion, and then we lock up the bad guys or whatever it is, and then pat ourselves on the back and go on to the next one. But it became very clear to me that wasn't good enough. So what we then did was, well, there are some very obvious lessons learned or recommendations to come out of this investigation. So to prevent this from happening again, we need to start embedding these recommendations. And then that evolved into this whole concept of prevention. And prevention is the key to all of this. And this is something that we, as the fraud function that I run, we remind ourselves frequently that our primary function is the prevention of fraud. And only if we have arguably failed in that prevention do we then have to do the other things, which is, responding to incidents, managing reports, all that side of thing. But we need to focus our efforts as much as humanly possible in the prevention sphere. So we started racking up fairly quickly a long list of lessons learned and recommendations, which then started to coagulate into themes and trends and things we started to see, that then turned into the counter fraud standards. So they were all born from live cases that we could all refer back to, because we find that actually telling people the story behind the news, if you see what I mean, case studies is the key. So I can, in an internal webinar like we've got next week for Charity Fraud Awareness Week, we're doing a few global webinars, and I can prattle on all day about functional standards and all of these different things. But what gets people's attention is when you start telling stories about things that happen. So all of these sort of standards that we have all have case studies that sit behind them that are suitably redacted. We make sure that no one is embarrassed, names are taken out, etc., etc. But we find that by using the case studies to bring this alive, because as I said before, the vast majority of colleagues in my organisation are absolutely amazed that people do this stuff. So when they hear it, they can't believe their ears, and it really does bring it alive. And also it means that the global counter fraud standards that we do, they're real and they mean something, because they are actually born out of real cases. It's not just stuff that somebody has made up. It's stuff that has actually, formed through the cases that we've kind of done.
So with both of them, the external content and obviously the global counter fraud standard, I think just making that point, which I am always really passionate about, as you both all know separately, it's keep it clear, keep it simple, don't overcomplicate it. We know that charities are so limited on time and budget. Just be clear and make it easy to follow. I think that's one of the main lines that I would certainly like to emphasize.
Absolutely.
For both. Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I was going to ask a question, Dave. I was really picking up on your message about, the prevention measures that we can have in place to support charities to prevent fraud from occurring. But, from experience, I think there's also that message, and I think you alluded to it as well, as charities having really strong response plans when fraud occurs, because, it can go south pretty quickly if charities don't have really strong response plans, whether it deals with cybersecurity or how they, get on the front foot and message things publicly to protect their reputation. I was just interested in the experience from your experience, whether that rings true as well, because while we focus very much on the preventative measures with the ACNC as well, we do encourage charities to have that response plan in place as well to prevent the damage when it does occur. And I think you mentioned, Dave, yourself, sometimes it's not a matter of if, but when. Is that your experience as well?
Oh, absolutely. And in my mind, there are two absolutely critical documents that every fraud must have. One is a fraud policy, which basically says, don't commit fraud. And if you do, these will be the consequences. So you've drawn your line in the sand. And the second one is a fraud response plan, which there's plenty of versions of them online. They don't need to be complicated. They could be a one-pager as an appendix to your fraud policy if you want to keep it really simple. We created our fraud policy, our fraud response plan. It's reviewed every year and refreshed every year because things do change. We have better ideas, and we went, who wrote this stuff last year? This is rubbish. And then we realised it was me. But things do change. But we keep it. Well, we also, as well as having it online, we also sent out a hard copy to our country directors some years ago now. And we probably wouldn't do this for cost reasons now, but the theory is that when a fraud landed on their desk, they could reach behind them into their bookshelf, pull it off the shelf, blow all the dust off it, open it up, and like first thing is stay calm, do not panic. This, and if you just follow these simple steps through, it will enable you to do this in an appropriate way. The things like don't immediately rush in to investigate it yourself, because many cases have been sort of compromised by a well-intended but amateurish investigation, those sorts of things. But yeah, in short, having a fraud response plan in some way, shape, or form is an absolute essential.
Thanks.
Which kind of matches with the report, don't you think, Hope, for us? Things flagging that importance of response plans and.
Yeah, so we know that charities want and need response plans. It's one of the things we're requested of us regularly. It's one thing that actually gets asked for, and we do have some resources around it. But yeah, internal controls make such an impressive difference. Again, it's one of the things that flags. Yeah, internal controls flagged 62% of the reported frauds. So we know that internal controls are doing those things, and hopefully that means people are using them. And yeah, I think that Dave, you're bringing up of why like using case studies to build your arsenal against fraud, your preventative tools, can also relate to charities who haven't yet spotted fraud. Other charities are talking about fraud. They're doing it at events. They're doing it sat here. They've written like case studies up previously. People are talking about it. So learning from other people's issues, other people's having been victims of fraud, can go a long way to you writing your own. Because actually, if someone is targeting charities that look like yours, it's only a matter of time before you're the next target. And all of these things go into building those, those policies against fraud.
Yeah, and the problem is that no one wants to be the charity that doesn't have these things in place, because they will soon become the biggest target. If you've got charities that are and I've seen, I'm fortunate, I'm not sure whether that's the right word, to have been involved in all 9 of the charity fraud awareness weeks and the 10th one next year. I'm not sure anybody has that illustrious claim, but to see the evolution of the way that charities has gone over the last decade has been genuinely tremendous. And I've got to give the fraud advisory panel an awful lot of credit for that, because you've been at the absolute forefront of that throughout, and for that I thank you. But if I think back to sort of 9 years ago when we were talking about the first one, trying to get charities to take fraud seriously was like a big challenge, because again it was we're a charity, so who'd commit fraud against us defense was never stronger. Over the years, we've seen charities big and small start to take this far more seriously. And it's very easy for me, as an alleged counter fraud professional, working for one of the, if not the largest charities in the United Kingdom, with a team, for me to sort of say, you need to do this, you need to do that. Everything we say is looking at the charities that don't have that luxury, only have some sort of trustees or a few employees. So that's why we need to sort of keep it sort of fairly straightforward. But the simple fact is that people who target charities for fraud, and there are those people out there in the world, they will target the weak, they will target the most vulnerable in society, and that includes the charity sector. So when you've got 2 charities in the field, one of them has got an evolved to any point charity fraud framework, and the other one is still relying on well, we're a charity, so who'd commit fraud against us defense, then the organized crime gang wouldn't, they'll be the ones they'll target. So it's just a matter of trying to get ahead of that, because disruption is as important as everything else. If we can disrupt their criminal activity so they target another sector aside from the charity sector, then that's a huge win.
And I'll drive a point home just because it's going to come up earlier in the week. I'm sitting down with Louisa Burton to have a chat about how to implement guidance. But one of the things that's come out from everyone this morning is that we all rely on collaboration. We work with other charities. We talk to lots of people. The Charity Fraud Awareness Week exists for that purpose. One of the things that Louisa found in her research, and it will already be out by this point, is that charities that collaborated with others who worked in groups were more likely to use guidance. I think part of it comes back to you don't want to be the only one left without a policy, because you're then the
Yeah.
biggest target. So if you know everyone else has done it, you know all those frauds are coming, then actually you're more likely to put it into practice. So being part of these groups, talking to other charities, even if it's just like a LinkedIn search or joining another group of charities that you know exists, then all of those things are going to help you in the long run and will hopefully help guide you in writing whatever you need as a charity to write.
Yeah, and obviously in the UK, to the UK audience, we've got the Charities Against Fraud group, which I chaired for a period of time, and Matt, I think you're chairing now. But it is a very useful sort of group of like-minded charities that as we're very, very inclusive. Any organisation that is interested to join should do so, because if you need to be put into contact with somebody that can help with all of this stuff, then that's probably as good a place as any.
That leads on actually to a point that I was going to make, but that helps. That helps it even more, to be honest. The Charities Against Fraud group, Ian, and obviously everyone watching, that's been going obviously for a while. But I think I've, as Dave said, taken over the chair of it, and I think we've had to take a step back and just realise how good that group actually is and how unique it is, and the work that Dave has done over the last few years to get that group to where it is incredible. We meet every, I think it's 2-3 months, and charities just getting together, representatives from different charities joining these calls to talk about the threats, what they're facing, that collaboration. It's really a highlight of combating charity fraud. And again, mindful of the audience who'd be watching this, I would really encourage different countries to kind of take that model, get something together. Going back to the point of it being simple, Dave has led it incredibly well to a point where people join, discuss it, and it's not admin heavy, it's not problematic. Charity Commission supported with the secretariat function. But it's the idea is get people together, communicate openly, share that information, and it has been so successful in that we're looking at taking that model potentially to other sectors outside of charities. Say that if we've got X amount of charities that can talk, why can't industry A, B, C, D? Because it's the one thing that I think, economic crime, fraud brings everyone together regardless of competition. You should be able to sit down in a room and or online and work together. What I was just going to briefly cover before we finish is the conduct standards. Ian, you mentioned about I think new charities and smaller charities. We do a lot of work in the UK and Charity Fraud Awareness Week to support those smaller charities. How would you, so for anyone out in a different country who says they're looking at standards, they need to grow them, they need to develop them, and this is a question for you as well, Dave. But Ian, how do you ensure that those new charities, or ones that have changed, are aware of your standards and can implement them? How do they get that support?
It is a challenge, to be honest, because one of the things that we do observe is that, again, when charities are starting up, it seems to be such a kind of like intense experience for them, and they're trying to kind of like, deliver the charitable purpose as best they can. Often the emails they see receive from the regulator when their registration's been approved with, guidance and links to our website where the resource is available, they might be kind of like pushed aside sometimes, and we'll get onto that. As best we try to encourage that messaging. All our newly registered charities receive education and guidance to make them aware of their obligations, including their obligations under the external conduct standards. We also have a suite of regulatory tools that we try to use to kind of, catch those charities that might need that further education and guidance. You know, they're reporting to us, they're delivering on their charitable purpose, but are they at risk of fraud? So we conduct reviews. We did specific reviews on charities operating overseas in our last program year. The way that works is we just kind of engage with the charities more an approach where we don't tell them what they should be doing. We're there to listen and understand their experience and share that experience with the broader sector. So we publish guidance on our website. This is what we're observing. So, you know, one of the things that came out of that experience when we're dealing with overseas charities, it did specifically deal with overseas charities that were working with vulnerable children, is that there was a lot of trust in the partner organizations. That was probably the key theme that came through. You know, it comes back to your point, Dave, you know, charities having that mindset of, oh, like, we're a charity, we're doing good things, who would want to harm us? But we did see that come out quite often with the smaller charities that didn't have the skills in place on their board, you know, kind of going over, doing a visit to a small project overseas, saying, oh, these are great people. Of course, we want to support them. But there were no controls in place once the dollars started to flow overseas into the bank accounts. And that's where the risk was lying. So, yeah, just a few different tools that we've been using as a regulator to try to get those messages out there to encourage good governance.
Yeah, my answer to the same question is awareness raising is one of our key strategic areas. We have four: awareness raising, reporting and detection, responding to incidents, and prevention. So reporting is right up there. And the way that I look at it is it's the first sort of stone you throw into the mill pond to cause the ripples, because you need to raise awareness, because otherwise the organisation is still languishing in this, well, we're a lovely organisation who'd commit fraud against us. Then they need to realise that, you know, that what fraud is, how can they spot it, what can they do about it, what should they do about it? Because there's obviously a lot of confusion when something happens. Should they report it? Should they not report it? Will there be negative consequences towards them? What if they don't have enough evidence? So then you need to be able to provide some clarity. Now, the British Council, like all of your organisations, you know, although management of fraud is a small but important cog in that otherwise larger machine, and it's important that we have our platform. So therefore, what we sort of try to do is ensure that we use what I call the bouncy castle communication approach, which is small but often. Keep it inflated, because if we start going on about fraud too much, we'll lose the audience, because they'll be thinking, well, the British Council is all about, you know, cultural relations and educational opportunities, not all about preventing fraud. And so people will sort of turn off us because we're doing too much. But if we don't do enough, people will forget, people won't know how to report, and that kind of confusion will start to come in again. So bouncy castle, little and often, just keep it inflated. So we do quite a lot of comms, and so as an example, this year we saw a slight downturn in cases in sort of quarter one, quarter two. So what did we do? We turned up the awareness raising dial, and then cases started to come back in again. So we sort of ease and squeeze on the awareness raising as we need to. But you know, we do, as I said, little and often. We do some webinars. We'll have an article on our intranet site. You know, we've done some comedy skits. We've done some quizzes. We've done all sorts of things. We don't do too much for reasons I've mentioned, but we do just keep like a regular drumbeat of fraud things to keep the organisation just remember that we're still there.
It's interesting because when we write content for, so whether that be social media, going into events, anything like that, the first point that always comes out, the first thing I'll write on anything, the first thing that will definitely get reviewed by Matt, is some kind of post around talking to your staff about fraud, talking to your volunteers. Because if you're noticing like trends in your real, like in your actual life, not your work life, but in your like day to day, I've got loads of spam text messages. I've had loads of this. I've had loads of that. People keep ringing me. If you can just mention it in your workspace for your volunteers, just a heads up, guys, this is happening more often. Oh, I've had something from someone I follow on LinkedIn that they're seeing more of this kind of fraud, just mentioning it, bringing it up, making them aware. Your bouncy castle approach is actually fantastic, Dave. That is like just bringing it up, just saying it. Like, don't be scared to mention that fraud is happening and you are spotting it, you are seeing it. That's something to be praised, that you can
Don't be scared to mention the F word.
Yeah, the F word.
Yeah. But the other thing, the final thing I'll say, because I appreciate the time is against us, but we're very lucky to have high level support, with our CEO and particularly our COO, who is our sort of fraud champion on the board. For example, we're doing 2 internal global webinars next week, and he's appearing on both. He doesn't need to do that. He's a very busy man, but he does so because he recognises the importance of this subject matter, and he knows full well the tone at the top is critically important, and just by him appearing and saying a few kind words at the beginning of the presentation just gets everyone's attention, and that's really all we're looking for. So yeah, tone at the top is also really important.
I think bringing this sort of to a conclusion, if we look at the two areas, the regulators and the charities, communication is obviously one of the main things that I've taken away from this, the importance of regulators, charities to engage with each other, simplicity and clarity around the respective roles. Charities need to have a fraud prevention plan and a response plan in place. It doesn't need to be complicated. It doesn't need to be 100 pages. It just needs to be, this is what you need to do. I think the external conduct standards and the global counter fraud standards are 2 huge successes. That's why obviously we're having this conversation, that I'd really encourage others to match and to look at that model. And managing and reviewing, I think that's also something as well. We can implement these things whether we are a charity or a regulator, but we need to make sure that they're working. And I think if we look at Charity Fraud Awareness Week, that ongoing conversation, and maybe when I asked about COMSI, and if we look at where we've come from 9 years ago, even in a couple of years I've been involved with this, Charity Fraud Awareness Week, International Charity Fraud Awareness Week, just continues to grow. And I would really be happy if we could say, within our respective countries, we will continue engaging, but we could use this week to, within your own countries, to promote your own messaging. If we can across the globe know that this is the week, these are the general messages, it's going to be around prevention, X, Y, Z, but countries A, B, and C, these are the messages you need to use. You need to get out to your charities, you need to get out to the local organisations. Use the week for that, especially as we head into the 10th next year. Let everyone know that this is a particular time to use the global messaging, but your own as well.